My name is Ella Whelan. I am the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival with the Academy of Ideas, and I'm also an author and a journalist. But today, very delighted to be the chair for this debate, Girl, Boy, Other, How Do We Talk to Kids About Gender? And when I tell you that I was nervous about doing this debate, I mean I was nervous. Not because I don't think it's an important debate or because I don't think that it can be done, but because the nature of the discussion about gender, more broadly, but also gender in relation to children or young people, because we're going to go across the age groups of young people today, is tricky. It's tricky because on both sides there are very strong feelings. Personal experience comes into this in a very tricky way, which means it can often mean that talking about this is, people find it hurtful, people find it difficult to deal with. But particularly when it comes to talking about gender in an education perspective, within the classroom, within the realm of schools, I think it's very important that we try to compassionately go beyond the fright that I had of offending people or of opening up a can of worms in relation to talking about gender and kids, and talk about it, because I tell you there are lots of changes that are happening in relation to sex education, PHSE, SRE, whatever it's called these days, in relation to how we talk to kids about sex and relationships, and particularly about how we talk to kids about their own sense of self, their identity, how we answer questions that aren't what's 4 times 4, but is about who am I, why am I feeling these things, what do I do about this, what do I call myself? And more in the realm of the classroom and under the teacher's remit, the socialization of kids and how they gain a sense of themselves is taking place in the classroom for good or ill. So I'm glad that I got over my initial fright and decided to put it on. And I'm very glad that I have this fantastic panel to help us through this. Opening apology before we introduce our other 4 speakers from Rose Frimpong, who's had to pull out last minute because of a family emergency. But I'm sure that you'll be hearing from her in successive battles. And if you want to find out more about her work, you can look at the website. But I'm delighted to be here with our 4 panelists for today, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. They'll give some opening speeches, and then we'll get stuck into it from the audience. So first to speak is Dr. Deborah Hayton, who's here on my left. Deborah is a science teacher and a trade union officer, originally from the north of England, and she's lived in the West Midlands for 25 years. She teaches physics at a secondary school in Coventry, and after transitioning in 2012, she's written extensively about what it means to be trans, about how trans rights can be protected without compromising the rights of women or safeguarding of children. And Deborah has written all over the place and appeared all over the place, The Spectator, in Unheard, The Times, Morning Star, The Economist, and she has often been involved in debates that have gotten particularly fiery. She's been a voice of calm and reason in many ways. So thank you, Deborah, for joining us at the Battle of Ideas Festival. Next to speak after Deborah is Katie John Wendt, who's here on my right. Katie is a consultant and a speaker on confident authenticity in communication and conversation, and she creates and facilitates dialogue and discussion around unconscious bias, diversity and inclusion, and social cultural change, working with organisations like Pick My Brain and the Human Library. And she has a really long and broad experience of working with diversity and identity and difference, for example, LGBT+, mental health, mood and neurodiversity and disability issues, but particularly around belonging and well-being. And she too has featured on TV and radio and podcasts, doing TEDx talks on the steps of city halls, addressing panels and audiences. And when I asked Katie to do this discussion, I was really pleased at the fact that we had a good long chin wag about the importance of debate. So I'm really pleased that she welcomes the spirit of the festival. Next to speak will be Claire Mcguigan, who is here on my left-hand side. Dr. Claire Mcguigan is a principal educational and child psychologist. Her interests are around supporting families and promoting social inclusion for children with SEND and utilising positive psychology to improve the well-being of all children. And Claire is also the co-founder and the host of a really exciting podcast called Not the Easy Way, which is, you should Google it and find out about it, or better yet, come to Claire and talk about it after the session, which is looking at in particular the ways in which we can talk to children about the difficult things that they might face, from very practical realities of school life and school work, right up to figuring out how to talk about things that have often become dirty words these days, like resilience, how to overcome barriers, how to do things that are not the easy way, not the lazy way. And finally, we have Chrissy Daz, who is here right next to me on my right. Chrissy has for more than 20 years worked as a school teacher in both the primary and secondary sectors. He originally studied fine art and design technology at Nottingham Trent University and occasionally performs musical cabaret both in and out of drag. And he's currently writing a book about transgender and gender variant identity. And Chrissy joined me on a panel which was about identity and this sense of who we are and how we form our ideas, kind of in the frame of gender, but it broadened out at a previous Battle of Ideas festival and was so fantastically interesting on that I had to get him back on this panel. So if we can start with you, Deborah, your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Ella, and good afternoon, everybody. As Ella said, my name's Debbie Hayton. I'm a secondary school science teacher. I've been in the classroom 26 years, in which time I've seen most things come and go. Before that, I was a postdoctoral research fellow, so I'm scientifically trained and I come from a scientific background. I transitioned 9 years ago. What did that mean? My hair got longer, my wardrobe changed a bit, hormone therapy, gender surgery. I think in some ways I'm coming out the other side of it after 9 years. I have 3 things to say today, and there's 2 questions and a wake-up call. First of the questions. Today's title is, how do we talk to kids about gender? I wonder why we're not asking, how do we talk to kids about sex? Secondly, what is gender identity? And I've not yet been persuaded that this thing actually exists, by the way, so I'll come back to that later as well. And then the wake-up call. We're in this intellectual debate here, but the context is scary. Children are being harmed, and I'll start with that. And we're promoting this concept of gender identity that nobody understands, to children who lack the maturity to understand what they're being told. Children are being told they can choose their gender, whatever that means. Maybe they can, but it depends upon how adults choose to define gender. But nobody can choose their sex, because that's the truth, and that truth is being denied, and children are suffering as a result. Lots of children. According to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, almost 2% of high school students now say they're transgender. And from a UK perspective of my experience working with children, I have no reason to suspect we're any different in the UK than the US. But what does this thing transgender mean? Again, we're not sure. It's usually explained as having a gender identity that does not match our sex assigned at birth. And then it's said that gender identity determines whether we are men or women. But what it is unclear. It's like a magic essence inside our heads. It's unprovable, and it's beyond any diagnostic test. If I say I'm a woman, then who can contradict me? 10 years ago, when I transitioned, I was convinced I was some sort of woman, and I got very upset when others didn't believe me. And my mental health at the time depended on how other people reacted to my assertions, and assertions I knew I couldn't prove. And I was an adult, and I was otherwise secure and established in life. But here we're talking about children who are not secure. They're making their way out in life. They're not yet established. These are vulnerable people by definition. Things have changed. During my childhood, girls were told that it was normal for girls to have short hair, wear dungarees and play with trucks. That's what I was used to when I was growing up. Parents, progressive parents at least, might have told their sons that it was normal for boys to play with dolls and wear dresses, but that's harder. But now, parents of gender non-conforming children are being told that their children might be trans. And indeed, the actual diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria in children in the DSM includes, and I quote, in boys, a strong rejection of typically masculine toys, games and activities, and a strong avoidance of rough and tumble play. And in girls, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games and activities. This is all based on sex stereotypes. What we've done is we've taken gender non-conforming behaviour and pathologized it. But that hardly scratches the surface. If you go online and look at the online cultures, they're grooming children into all kinds of self-declared gender identities. And it's nothing more than a belief system. And it's moved from beyond even a formal diagnosis into an informed consent. but informed consent from children who are too young to understand what they're consenting to. That's my concern. And the treatment protocol that comes along, the Dutch protocol, which has spread across the world, is terrifying. Puberty blockers, followed by cross-sex hormones, and either surgery or the promise of surgery. And this has been offered to children before they can possibly understand what it means to be an adult. To say that children are suffering is a gross understatement. Some children across the world, as a result of this debate, have been sterilised before they can possibly know what it means to be an adult, before they can possibly know what it means to have their own children, or that adult desire to have their own children. But debate has been suppressed by intimidation from activists. I'm really pleased that we're able to have this debate here, Ella. Everything rests on, I'm coming back to the questions now, everything rests on gender identity. And as I said, I don't think it exists. Psychological disorders certainly exist. People can believe that they're too fat or too thin. Some people believe they hear voices. Others flip between extremes of emotion. Some of us think that we should have been the opposite sex. But somehow we've been treating this last condition differently to the rest. Rather than explore how we can live with ourselves and our disorders, we've been told we have a gender identity. We can transition to bring our bodies into line. But it's all unprovable and unfalsifiable, and the burden of proof is on its adherents. And it matters. This is where it matters. It matters because what's been happening is that gender identity has been replacing biological sex. Now, by that, I mean our reproductive role, our bodies, whether they have been evolved to produce sperm or egg. That's what sex is, and there's two of them. And that's always been the distinction between men and women. But what this debate or non-debate has done, it's made this concept of sex unspeakable. We're not supposed to be talking about this. Meanwhile, many gender non-conforming children would have become gay men or lesbian women if they'd been left alone. There's also an alarming overlap with autistic spectrum conditions. Are we now repeating some of the worst historic abuses of medicine against minorities and against children? We need to be investigating this phenomena and not affirming it. Certainly not teaching gender identity as some truth. It's mere conjecture, a supernatural belief even. Sex has been around for over 1 billion years. We have sex bodies like every other sexually dimorphic species on the planet. And that's the truth. And maybe, as I started off with, we should be asking, how do we talk to kids about sex? Because it is sex that is real. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. Katie, your thoughts?
Thank you. I've very little prepped on this because in many respects I want to give as much opportunity to questions and responses later as well. So no big, huge speech from me, other than to say that I partially agree with Debbie, which in trans circles is controversial. You're only meant to have one opinion in trans circles, which is why I do believe coming to something like this is great, but I wish there was an even more diverse cross-section of thought at this conference already this weekend. Because one of the things we've had is the shutdown of discussion about these things, and that does concern me as an older person, particularly because the way I discovered who I was and how I want to express myself was by discussion with myself, discussion with therapists, discussion with friends, and discussion in educational places. But I am actually the product of a child that actually managed to go through school without SRE. So the idea that SRE would make me trans is clearly not the case. I went to a public school that had 0 sex education, amongst other things. But what I do remember at the outset of my life in many respects is that whilst we all have sex in that sense, and whilst gender might be a wibbly-wobbly thing that Debbie and I both agree to some extent is magic, essence, where is it, what is it, how do we define it? And people will continue to debate it, and it, will keep Judith Butler in writing opportunities, which I kind of love the whole idea about that. But the point, what I'm trying to say is that when we're young, kids are kids. And whilst they're born with a sex, initially they are simply kids are kids. And I grew up with friends who were kids, who were children, who were friends. And those were the labels you tended to attach to them far more than simply boy-girl. And if I climbed a tree with the girl next door, it was 2 kids climbing a tree. And it was only when we actually entered the education system that was the first time I heard phrases like girls sit here, boys sit here. Oh, girls play netball, boys play basketball. Or in other words, the gender rules and roles began to come in actually in the education system to a degree. And I'm nearly 55, so that gives you an idea of what generation I was growing up in. And that's what I was exposed to. So I was exposed to the rules and the roles of gender stereotyping once I hit the education system at a time when it was not at all teaching gender identity. So that shows you the kind of conflict I was going through in part as a kid. I have to say that I have various types of skin in the game, in the sense that when someone asks me how do you identify, Katie, I say I actually identify as trans. I don't claim or identify as the word woman per se. If you want to use the term non-binary, I'm happy with that as well. I like person, like human. But growing up, I had an endocrine disorder as well that meant I was nothing like my peer males. My puberty hit me 4 years after every other male because of an insensitivity to androgen. So I accept, therefore, that there is biological variation within sex. So I'm not saying that there are third sexes or fourth sexes or fifth sexes, but I'm saying that how people exist within a sex and how people express that as gender is far more than simply binary, even without saying that sex isn't necessarily non-binary per se. What I find interesting, is I think that having gone through transition myself and having also realised that, well, actually, that I feel sorted in that sense. It did solve my psychological dilemmas. My psychiatrist called me the most reluctant transsexual he'd ever met. I went through conversion therapy by choice, didn't work. I married a psychiatrist, didn't work. 15 years, I tried really hard on that one. I put myself through therapy multiple times, didn't change anything still. I actually went to them and said, can you stop me being trans? I went to sex workshops in America to try and see if I was autogynephilic. I tried everything. I tried lots of sex. I tried sex with men, tried sex with women. I tried anything to avoid being trans. Clearly it didn't work. What I reflect on, and one of my areas of study is I used to be a theologian, and so I'm fascinated by anthropology and history and the way different cultures exist and challenge and consider things like LGBT. And the language that we have in the West is different to the language in different cultures and different epochs, etc. So language changes. People don't particularly. And sometimes we change in response to the language of the culture we're in, etc. What I find interesting is, and one of the people I like to study a lot, is when you hear, and even discussions we've had in other debates today already, the idea that it's a fad, it's responding to a current situation. I think we heard just recently in a panel an hour or so back that it's a West Coast Californian import to Britain, and yet has also been around 5 or 6 generations. Both can't be true. Particularly when you go back to someone like Magnus Hirschfeld, who in 1904 wrote a book called The Third Sex, as a literal English translation. Yet that's language that many people are now saying, you can't use that language. But it was used 117 years ago. And it was actually used much in the way that young people are reclaiming the word queer as an embracing term to cover aspects of sex, gender, or sexuality that are outside the typical expression of them. And third sex was used back then to describe gay, intersex, and anyone cross-dressing or expressing as another gender. And it was as prominent even then amongst women, people born female as well as people born male. So the idea that this is a modern thing that has been conjured up by the Tavistock, by social media, by education, to me is a myth in that sense. So if you study history, you will see it's always been there to an extent. What we do have, though, is social media and awareness raising, which does lead people to feel slightly more safer being out. But being out, to me, does not mean there is an outcome. And I think what we need to generate is the possibility of being able to discuss gender in schools, being able to discuss sex in schools, but not able to predict sex or define what outcome is necessary just because you are apparently subverting it in some way. I wish everybody in school subverted sex and gender, whatever you want to call them, because I wish everybody in school had the freedom to be an individual and not a product and not some kind of sex or gender stereotype rule or role. So the way I see gender is a stepping stone to actually human freedom of expression, to human bodily autonomy, to do that which your body you want to do. But to do that to a degree, I also respect that I think you have to be an adult. So therefore, anything that is before adult has to be a discussion, not a destination. And that's why I do come down alongside a little bit of watch and wait. And as Debbie mentioned some stats around it, people do not always transition, and therefore there is a danger with early adoption of puberty blockers. But actually, the average age for adoption of puberty blockers is about 15. It's a myth that people at 11 get them like Smarties. It's really easy. We all know that actually, you can also listen to the stats around how hard it is to access trans healthcare, and the fact that it can actually be, 3.5 years before a first appointment, and then another 18 months at least before you're given any intervention. So it's already a 5-year path. The dilemma with the 5-year path that exists now is the fact that it is a medico-surgical path very often now, and lacks a lot of the therapeutic support on that journey because of the dilemma and the paucity of mental health support in child and adolescent care and in adults as well. So what I would be calling for is non-affirmative but safe explorative psychological support that should exist whilst people are pursuing their journeys. I believe therapy should be free for all at the point like the NHS really, and basically therapy doesn't mean that you're being confirmed in your destination, but it's getting company on your journey of exploration. And I think that's really what I want to say, that we need to create a safe space is a bit of an awkward word in its sense as well, but we need to create a safer space to discuss, and that's for everyone to be able to discuss. And within that, I think questioning gender, considering and understanding sex and sexuality, etc., they're all good. And what we need to be creating is the environment in which we can explore, can discuss, can dissect, can challenge. I think that's all I want to say on that for now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vincent. Claire.
I move that a little bit nearer. Yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm probably not going to need my 5 minutes, Ella, because during the lunch break, I realised I was eating my crisps in the corridor, and somebody standing next to me also eating his crisps in the corridor asked what I was talking about this afternoon, and I said it was how do we talk to children about gender. So he said, how do we? And I realised I summarised it in 4 words, and I thought, wow, I'm not going to need, I can tear up my notes. And the 4 words were developmentally appropriate and clear language. And basically that summarises my position about how we talk to all children, from very young children to adolescents and kind of young people, about how we talk about it. Developmentally appropriate, clear language. To expand on that a little bit, because I won't just leave you with the 4 words, although I was tempted to, there's some principles underpinning that. And again, those principles would remain the same, whether it's young children, adolescents, or kind of older young people. And those principles are that biological sex is a material reality and exists, and we need to have some clear shared language for labelling and describing that. And that needs to be, and it's not at the moment, and I think it's creating quite a lot, it's up for, it seems there's a discussion going on outside the schools, which is coming into schools and into parenting, that is confusing that the clarity around language linked to the material reality of biological sex. So I think we need to have a clear principle that we agree what that shared language is, so that we are not bringing that confusion around biological sex into these discussions with children, from young children to old children and young people. So that would be one principle that would underpin it all the way through when you're talking to children about gender. The other principle would be that we accept diversity, difference, and we embrace and celebrate gender nonconformity, just as really I think that's what, Katie, you were describing there, that you would like to see in schools. And that we, just as we do with other, it's a value that should exist within all schools, and that's a principle which, whatever sort of difference we're talking about, we are open to accepting that difference, understanding that difference, and helping children to understand that that is the value that underpins all of our approaches within education, and that we want parents to be framing their discussions with their children around, because it reflects the kind of society that we would want to have, which is around tolerance of difference of opinions and difference in all sorts of ways. And gender nonconformity would be one of those differences that we should be accepting. So saying that, given my 4 words and then those underpinning principles, I think what that would look like in reality is with young children, we don't really need to be discussing gender at all. We need to be having some clear, going back to that principle, we need to have the clear language around sex so that they understand that they have either one sort of body or another sort of body, and we have words for people with that sort of body and a different sort of body, and we have words that describe the bits on their body, just so that they know them and have some ways of labeling and describing the material reality of the world that they exist in. But then beyond that, we convey to them through our responses to them and to our responses to situations as they arrive. We convey those underlying principles and values, and we convey to them that yes, you might be a boy, which means somebody with a male body, or a girl, which means somebody with a female body. But beyond that, and in most situations, particularly when you get, when you get into school, that should be irrelevant. And you shouldn't necessarily, why should the girls need to sit on one sort of, people with one sort of body sit on one side of the room, people with the other sort of body sit on the other side of the room. But when you're talking about with young children, what we would do, how we would convey that without needing to discuss gender, is we would convey those principles as and when things arose. So you wouldn't have conversations with children, if a child challenged, say, one of the boys playing with what they thought were the girls' toys, you would respond to that saying, they're not girls' toys, they're toys. It's fine for Tommy to play with those toys. They're just toys. Anybody can play with those toys. And conversely, you would be saying things like, they're not boys' clothes, they're just clothes. Anybody can wear those clothes. And what we're conveying to young children then is that, yes, you have one sort of body or the other, but your body does not dictate in any way your personality, your preferences, your interests in life, and you are entirely free, without constraints from society based on the sort of body that you have, that you will be prevented from certain opportunities, prevented from certain interests. And really, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking what Debbie, you were saying, doesn't that sound a lot like the 1980s, Debbie? Or the 1970s? You think that's how we talked to, at the time when, I was a child in the 1970s, but then in the 1980s, it was the kind of gender was very, it was Boy George, David Bowie, that was, but we had clear language. We knew that they were men, but they were experimenting with gender. So they weren't, eyeliner was being expanded into being a man thing as well. So really, eyeliner, in some ways, what I'm describing here is not a new idea. It's a let's go back to that idea. And then I would say, applying my 4 words, developmentally appropriate, clear language, with those underlying principles, that biological sex exists and we accept gender nonconformity and diversity and all differences. When you start applying that to adolescents and older young people, then I would say that, then we do need to start talking about gender, and we need to start talking about it because it's been spoken about in wider society, and it's a fascinating topic, and they're interested in it, and they're already talking about it, and we need to be talking to them about pretty much everything when it gets to that point. We need to be having open conversations on interesting issues where they will be individually start exploring their own identity, sexuality. They might well be playing with gender in lots of different ways, or exploring gender in lots of different ways. So while they're doing that individually, and whilst there's at the moment, quite a contentious debate in wider society going on about that, we need to be bringing those sorts of conversations into schools, into the classrooms, into societies, and into society at large, and conveying the message to young people, going back to the principle that diversity is tolerated and diversity of viewpoint is also tolerated. And that's another really important reason that we need to talk to them about that, not only because are they already exploring that, but often what's happening at the moment is that's been explored quite individually or in certain groups, often on the internet, or in maybe quite insular peer groups at times. What we want is young people to keep their minds open. And actually that's illustrated by another conversation that I had at lunchtime. I had a very productive lunchtime where somebody else asked me what I was speaking about, and shared that they had a 15-year-old son who was exploring gender identity, and we had a little conversation about, tricky as a parent to navigate that. But we both agreed, really, what I was going to share with you here, that actually the best approach for talking to adolescents and young people about gender is to keep things as open as possible, keep the discussion open, keep their minds open, they might feel at that time that, well, they probably will feel as well if they're 15, that they're very clear what they think and they're probably going to think it forever. And that's fine. But you keep saying you think that, you might think it forever, but not everybody thinks that. There might be other ways of looking at it. Gender is not a resolved issue, as I think... How did you describe it, Katie?
Wibbly wobbly.
Wibbly wobbly. Yes, it's
Highly scientific.
That would be a lovely way to raise it with a 15-year-old. It's wibbly wobbly. They probably wouldn't appreciate you describing their very serious conversation they're trying to have with you. It's wibbly wobbly. But what we would want to be doing with young people is, yes, talking about gender, but talking about it openly and exploratory and in a curious way, and keeping their minds open and trying to ensure that they agree with those underlying principles that I mentioned in the beginning and would go back to, which would be around tolerance and acceptance of difference.
Thank you, Claire. Chrissy, your opening thoughts.
Okay. All right, before I start, I'd just like to declare my pronouns. They are I, me, and my. Thank you. I want to actually make three fairly disparate points before moving on to tentatively address the question in the title of this discussion. Although I would like to suggest maybe a better question would be, should we talk to kids at all about anything? Okay, joke's over. Right, so 3 points. Firstly, I would like to just sort of look fairly briefly at trans experience over the last 40 to 50 years, which is around about the time that I've been a conscious being in the world. Then I would like to look at gender dysphoria itself and maybe make a suggestion as to how we could to understand that, and that might be helpful. Thirdly, I would like to look at the changing relationship between society and the individual over that same sort of period. So a much broader point. Okay, so point one then, trans experience. I think 40 to 50 years ago, I think everyone would have to agree that it was a pretty hostile world to be trans, along with many other minority ways of being. The tabloid was pretty unkind, tended to treat trans people as a freak show. Public opinion was probably characterized by a combination of incredulity, ridicule, indifference, and so forth. So I think what happened as a consequence of that is that trans people themselves and people who supported trans people and the idea of trans rights did not do the difficult thing, which would be to confront public opinion and to try to win people over to a different way of thinking. Rather than do that, they went behind the public's back. So you had a lot of lobbying, essentially, of judges, professors in universities, members of the medical establishment, charity workers. So in other words, elite circles were involved in this question of trans rights. But what emerged is it was only probably about 10 years ago that this suddenly exploded into the public domain. People were not aware of the changes that had happened. I've met quite a few trans people themselves that up until say that same sort of time, 10 years ago, were not aware of the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, 2005, which we might talk about a bit later, so I won't go into the details of that. Okay, so that's my first point, is that things would have been different if the campaign had taken a more sort of an approach that was more to do with trying to engage the public, rather than leaving the public feeling, what's going on? I don't understand what's happened here. My second point, which is about gender dysphoria, is that one of the problems that I think trans people have always had is the difficulty of explaining, what is this thing about I feel as though I'm trapped in the wrong body? Because to most people, that's not very convincing. Scientifically, it doesn't make any sense. So I think there are many ways, as Debbie said at the beginning, no one really understands it. There are many sort of possible things that might be going on there. One thing I would like to point out, which I think may be critical, to to do with why it feels so deep-rooted to many people. And I think that it's actually nothing to do with biology, and it's nothing to do with the psychology and the things that you might think about, such as Freud or things like that. But it is more to do with cognitive development in early childhood. So you have to remember that children come into the world knowing absolutely nothing and not really having any of the techniques, the sort of structures to make sense of the world. So they immediately have to start putting everything into a category, comparing everything with everything else, and saying this is that sort of thing, that's that sort of thing, etc., etc. And probably the most significant of these categories in which a child actually has to include themselves is gender. And it's at this point, around the ages of 4 to 8, that children become what psychologists call gender detectives. In other words, they're looking at every sort of thing and every type of behavior and trying to work out, is that for girls or boys? So for instance, a boy might see a girl eating an apple or something as equally ridiculous as that and think, does that mean eating apples is a girl's thing? And the other point is that around the same age, children have not yet become aware that sex is a fixed category. They don't yet understand that if you're a boy, you will develop into being a man and so forth. So that this creates a sense of anxiety around those categories. And I think that it isn't that surprising, perhaps, that some children at that age, almost by accident, might categorize themselves in the wrong box. It might then become a completely latent thing, but then it might re-emerge. So around adolescence, maybe even into adulthood, this sense of being trapped in the wrong body that could quite easily relate back to this sort of cognitive issue, as I suggested. Right, next point, society and the individual. Now, about 5 years ago, I speaking at the Battle of Ideas, I made a distinction between three different paradigms over, again, the last sort of 50 years in how gender has been understood. Firstly, there was the idea that gender was all about the sexual division of labour. That's how everybody understood gender, from feminists to conservatives back in the 70s and the 80s. That gradually shifted into an idea of gender being to do with interpersonal relationships, and finally ended up with this sense of gender as being this inner mood, that it doesn't really relate to other people or to society in any way whatsoever. Recently, I came across quite an interesting idea about identity formation from this guy called Hans-Gerd Müller, who's a philosopher. And he talks about 3 different ways in which identity is formed. The first 2, he's borrowed from an American thinker called Lionel Trilling, are sincerity and authenticity. So very, very briefly, you form your sense of identity in sincerity in terms of the role that is given to you, and the question then is how well you fulfill that role. So going back in history, that is largely to do with the sort of job you're going to be doing in society, and that goes across lots of social categories. The second one, authenticity, started to come into its own in the first half of the 20th century, which is to do with the fact that that sort of caste system was breaking down quite significantly, and the idea was you could develop your individual identity for yourself. You could create your own values, your own meanings. The third idea about identity formation is something called prophilicity, which is very much to do with the social media age, which is how you curate, how you present yourself to the world. Now, just a quick point about authenticity. I think when this started to develop, this was about active engagement. It was about how you acted in the world, rather than what it has become, which is this sort of sense that is deep inside you. The problem with this sort of deep inside internal mood idea of authentic identity is the more you go into that, the more you go into nothingness, because we don't actually exist as social beings without social interaction. So we need the prophilicity to sort of back up that sense. We need to constantly keep showing the world, this is who I am. And we also need some sort of form of sincerity. This is the box that I have been put into, and I'm going to show that I fulfill that. Okay, quite a long divergence. Have I got any time left at all? To 1 minute. Okay, right. I'll just jump straight into one point, one little thing, which is a video of I think America's most famous trans kid, which is Jazz Jennings. You might have heard of her. And this was a video of her with her doctor, just at the point where, having been put onto puberty blockers, she was now going to go on to cross sex hormones and think about surgery. And it was at this point that her doctor explained to her that because she'd been on puberty blockers, her penis had not developed to a normal size for her age, and therefore there was going to be enormous difficulty in constructing a vagina from that penis. And she was absolutely shocked by this revelation. And you can't help thinking, how come such an important thing was not explained to her before she went on to puberty blockers? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chrissy.
I think that the discussion about biological sex from the panel kind of lacked nuance in sort of two ways. So firstly, like, you talked a lot about how biological sex is real, when it's not really. It's as much of a social construct as other things, because studies have suggested that about 1 in 50 people have an intersex condition. And so when it's that common, it's kind of weird to be drawing a binary distinction so easily. And just like the distinction between sexes and the line drawn is as important as classifying some people as tall and some as short, because, you know, it's something you have to talk about, but it's not a foundational part of everything. And then also talking about biological sex as if it's sort of immutable is very reductive, because biological sex exists in your DNA, and your DNA is just a code, and when the code isn't read and used, it's kind of meaningless. And so people on hormones, on replacement stuff for a long time, their biological sex in a lot of ways doesn't really matter. And so, you know, changing the focus from gender, which is made up in every way, to something that's made up in just how we draw lines, doesn't really change the made upness of it. And I think just the way that sex is discussed as more scientific is a bit leaves out a lot of the conversation.
Brilliant, thank you. Panel, I'm going to take 4 or 5 and then come back to you.
So I have a question about, would it be, then, are you sort of suggesting that it would be ideal for children to be brought up in a society which is completely neutral, so you don't have any sort of categories, and you never define someone as being male or female, and you only define them as maybe having like an XX chromosome or an XY chromosome, for example? Because there was a sort of general consensus across the board that gender was socially constructed and was defined by socialization of the child. So in that respect, how far would you take the sort of neutralization of a society or of that socialization of that child, so that it goes as far as to removing pronouns completely? So would you just refer to every child as they, them from birth, or would you still utilize the he, she pronouns because they had an XX chromosome or an XY chromosome?
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because there is a tension here between whether or not you go full, you know, if you're saying that, I find myself saying a lot of the time, you know, gender is the least interesting thing about you, is like, go out and play, or like do your math homework, or shut up about it, kind of thing. Then actually is the way to go forward in a serious way, to say gender isn't important, let's be completely gender neutral. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl. It doesn't matter if you play with pink or blue. None of these things, these rules or social norms that society has organized itself around for quite some time, matter anymore? Or do you say, actually, these things do matter, and you are a girl, you are a boy, but if you are different, then okay, that's a different category and let's deal with it, which is a different way of approaching it than going down the whole let's not talk about gender thing.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I'd like to raise a small point that I think wasn't directly discussed. This is a point generally about any change that one would like to see in society, but I think it is very relevant here as well, which is there is some kind of ideal where we want to be, whatever that is for different people. We can discuss that. The truth of the matter is that the society will not change overnight. And I think it's important to also discuss how do we get there, because I think if we decide from now on universally to stop teaching or to start teaching children about sex and gender in a very different manner to which the wider society perceives it, we will actually end up with a lot of, I think, damaged kids. We have to the change. I'm not saying that we shouldn't want to be there. I'm saying that we should think exactly how to get there, and the intermediate stage might be different from how we would ideally like to teach. The thing I would also like to second is the person in front of me asked about pronouns, and it would be very nice to hear more of your views about that, because I think the way we use our language shapes a lot how we interact with the world and each other. And when it comes to education, I think that matters a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was just wondering why you think it's so bad to like experiment with gender as a child, even if you're wrong, because it just helps you grow as a person as long as you don't take any medical action with it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, that's often quite put forward as quite a kind of compromise, almost a compromise position, which is you can set, there, and lots of people who are on the side of this debate that would argue for greater experimentation in gender would say anything goes, but just no doctors involved, or no medicine involved, no surgeons involved. Wait. But then, of course, the other side is that then people who do go on to be very serious about changing their gender or becoming trans say, well, part of the tricky part of this discussion is that in many ways, the longer you wait, as Chrissy pointed out, sometimes you'll have problems that are very complicated problems, that actually the nature of us being human beings I've just been in a discussion about abortion and egg freezing, with ticking biological clocks that change as we grow, and particularly the process of going through puberty, what happens if you wait or what happens if you move? And so then the compromise position seems like not so much of a compromise anymore if you really want to have this change made to you. So let me throw this back to the panel, and then we'll come back out several times, so don't worry if you've had your hand out. Deborah, do you want to pick up on anything you've heard or make any points? And let's just keep it kind of a minute and a half, 2 minutes each.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, experimenting with gender is fine. As others have said, I grew up with this in the 1980s. Role models included Annie Lennox and David Bowie. David Bowie wore dresses, Annie Lennox wore a suit. But we knew that Annie Lennox was a woman and David Bowie was a man. And what they were doing was they were expanding what was allowed within their own sex to encompass, well, why can't people do that? What we in danger of teaching children is they've got to identify outside their sex in order to be themselves. And with that comes the dangers that we've been talking about. Because we do have a sex, we are our bodies, and we're the product of evolution. And just picking up on the intersex, I do want to say something about that. Intersex conditions do exist, but intersex people are male or female, just like everybody else. And it's not helpful to try and claim that they're a third sex, because they're not. People are either male or female. There is just two sexes. What I was saying about pronouns, you can use whatever pronouns you like about me. I don't care. Pronouns are for you to describe me, to make life easy for you. And as Chrissy said, my pronouns are I, me, and mine. And that's as far as I would go on that.
Okay, thanks. Let's move down just the table. So Claire, pick up on anything you like.
Yeah, I'll come back to the point about gender neutral, and whether what we were suggesting, or maybe what felt I was suggesting, was that it would be we'd be creating an entirely gender neutral kind of social environments for children who could, yes, they had a biological sex, but we didn't refer to that, and everything was presented neutrally. I don't think that's necessary. I think because I think you said that we were suggesting across the panel that gender is entirely socially constructed, and that's really fascinating. It's interesting that you picked up on that, because I don't necessarily think it is. And I think that's one of the really interesting discussions we need to be having. And, you know, when I was saying that actually when we're getting to adolescents and young people, I would love to be getting young people together in groups and asking exactly that question: is gender socially constructed? Because I think people are, wibbly wobbly. When it's not. Some people do think gender is entirely socially constructed. Some people are saying that gender is actually innate, and you have a very clear innate gender identity from very young. And some people seem to argue it's both at the same time or neither. I mean, I would say that actually, what we know from child development is that there do seem to be, very strong indicators that within sexes there seem to be tendencies to have certain preferences and make certain choices. And there does seem to be some innate factors within that. But of course, you can't separate that from the socialization. Obviously, then there is a huge impact of how we respond to those maybe innate preferences, how we respond to those culturally. We expect boys to behave in certain ways, maybe because boys behave in certain ways, and then we shape them to behave in certain ways. And then if you are a boy who doesn't conform to that, so you're gender non-conforming, actually your interests are more towards what would culturally be viewed as the feminine, and it might be culturally viewed as feminine because on the whole girls tend to prefer those things, then that will create you can see how that can then create real feelings of distress for children in the way that Chrissy was describing about that categorization. So I don't think we need to go down this I think it would be quite oppressive for children to be entirely gender neutral, because they will make their choices. But what I think we do is go back to those principles I was talking about, which is, yes, there is a material reality to the type of body that you have. And I would agree with what Debbie was saying in response to the, is biological sex reductive? I think when we bring kind of sexual development disorders in to try and argue that biological sex isn't dimorphic in mammals, I think we get into some, interesting discussions. And another discussion, it would be great, let's get young people together to discuss that. So I love these questions, and that's really one of my central points. The questions that are coming back from the audience are things that we need to be openly discussing. And at the moment, they're not. They're being discussed in separate, quite polarized positions, and they're unresolved and they're contentious, and people are presenting them as if they are resolved, and they're not. And we need young people to be keeping open minds and discussing and coming to an understanding of where they are, and us coming to the question of how do we bring about change. I think we bring it about through that discussion, and it's a process. And I think there's been an attempt to bring that change about without having the discussion, and I think that is what's created some of the big issues that are existing around this at the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chrissy.
Okay, I'm glad someone brought up the figure 1 in 50 for the intersex people, because I actually have the figures with me. It's a little less than that. It's a little less than 1.8%. And interestingly, that's worldwide. 1.5% of that, so the vast majority, is made up of populations in 2 distinct parts of the world. Firstly, there's the Dominican Republic, and then there's Papua New Guinea. And there is one particular condition which is very, very prevalent in those parts of the world, which is called late onset CAH, which is essentially, this is a condition where children with XY chromosomes are born. They haven't yet had the endocrinal development. So they have not been masculinized in the womb. So they appear to be girls, and it's in adolescence that they then start to develop male features. So they start to actually get a penis in early adolescence. Interestingly connected to that, Papua New Guinea, there's lots and lots of anthropologists who've gone over there since Margaret Mead. And one thing that does stand out, and I think there might well be a link here, is in a lot of those societies, a lot of them hunter-gatherer societies, there is quite a strong genderization of children. So in other words, you have boys who are segregated from the age of about 5 or so. They're taken away from their mothers and their sisters, and they are purged of all the feminine influences by being bled. They are then often imbued with masculizing influences, such as famously boys actually being filleted, fellating each other, giving each other blowjobs in order to absorb masculizing influences. So what you end up with is, in a society where there is possibly a good reason to believe that because obviously they don't have modern science, they don't know about chromosomes, to believe that sex is variable, that you therefore socially reinforce it as harshly as possible. Yes, I don't think that you necessarily have to connect sex and gender to science. Absolutely, we know what chromosomes are. Interestingly, how many of us know what our own chromosomes are? I've never had mine tested for a start. For instance, I mean, there's lots of expressions. We talk about sunrise every day. The sun's a beautiful sunset this evening, wasn't it? It's not a sunset, it's an earth turn. The sun stays put, it doesn't move at all. That's a non-scientific use of language. We could, in theory, develop an idea of sex and gender which is not absolutely linked to sex, but that's a different thing to what we're discussing, I think.
Okay, thank you. Katie?
I'm adopting that. Gender is a sunset. Sex is an earth turn. There you go. We've solved it. I'm often asked, actually, Katie, so how many sexes are there? And I usually go something along the lines of approximately about more or less 2. Just to be slightly scientific, to allow for the possibility that depending on whether you're measuring gametes or the 24 different chromosome combinations, of which mostly we see 2 of, but sometimes it can take 4 or 5 chromosome tests to prove you're only one or the other, because there are the rare exceptions where you can have, mosaicism, chimerism, and you've mentioned the huevadoces, which are well worth researching actually, and they're about the 2 communities. But those 2 communities that have the largest proportion of people with this syndrome do treat it quite differently from each other actually. One accepts it quite a lot and one less so. But that's a whole anthropological exploration of one particular intersex condition, which is one among, and if you look at different medical textbooks, you'll see anything from 30 to around 80 different conditions listed as intersex. And one of my concerns is something that Chrissy and Debbie have both said, has been almost moving towards a language of re-pathologizing trans. Whereas the general move has been to depathologize, and actually our history is that we depathologized homosexuality, which we considered a fetish and a deviancy, and then we gradually moved to depathologize gender identity, or whatever you want to call it. The language keeps changing as well, so let's not get stuck on the language, because it's been called many things if you just go back through all the various DSMs. As I said, I had the fortune to be married to a psychiatrist, so the DSM was in the house. But yeah, if there's the about approximately more or less 2 sexes thing, I then asked her, how many genders, Katie? Well, everyone laughs when you go and quote Facebook's 73 genders or 74. That's a gross underestimate. It's approximately 7 billion. One for everyone, which goes back to our perception of the sunset, shall we call it that? So I'll end on this bit. My perception, therefore, of raising kids in a gender-neutral way is raising 7 billion kids, not raising a gender-neutral they-dom, as it were. It's not, you can look at your dystopian or utopian visions of the future. Is it like everyone wearing a kind of an androgynous jumpsuit on Star Trek or something like that, or everyone looking like all the creatures in the Star Wars bar scene where everybody is a different alien to the next alien sat next to them? Anyway, that's me growing up in the 70s with sci-fi.
All right, let's hear some aliens on the floor, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to basically say that gender isn't... Most of us understand that gender is different from sex. We're not toddlers. We shouldn't be treated like toddlers. We have more capacity to understand than toddlers. And gender, as I see it, is more of a social construct, because it's, as you said, how each person perceives and identifies it. And the way that people see these labels as new and not something that has been around very long is completely ridiculous, because labels are just a way that we perceive each other and put into words how we can better respect and describe each other in a way that everyone can understand.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Thank you. That's it. Yeah, let's move forward.
So I think I'll just speak on this, as I'm sure many people will have. I've just turned 18, so I kind of have now this perspective of, having grown up and how I was taught about gender and sex. And the reality is I wasn't really taught about gender or sex as an actual conversation or anything like that. I don't feel any real attachment to whatever genitalia I have. I don't really feel any attachment to any gender I have. You can call me whatever you want. I don't care. I think there's this sort of like, what is the aim with the progressive movement that you want to go through when you're teaching kids about gender? Because I think a lot of people want to just end it as, you know, there's sex and then there's gender and you can be whatever gender you want, fine. Why is there such an attachment? I want to like ask this question to Hannah. Why is there such an attachment to biological sex? It is because of the socialization that we've had in the past. You know, there is a huge amount of genetic variation within the human species. You can pick any sort of variation you want to and make categories based on that. You can do it on hair color if you want. The reality is that, you know, obviously sex is a little bit different, but just, you know, teaching kids that biological sex is like an inherently important part of themselves, I don't think that's really necessary. And I know this is not a change that's going to just happen overnight, but overwhelmingly, I think we need to stop. I don't think biological sex should be relevant in all that many aspects of society. And I know it will continue to be for a while, but I don't think it should be. And I think this issue needs to be moved just from gender to also to sex, and to say that, you know, neither of these things have to be defining traits. If you want them to be, they can, but they don't have to be, and they probably shouldn't be in the near future.
Okay, thank you. It actually made me think of one of the arguments I often have with myself in my head and sometimes I like the idea of, you know, like nudist beaches in Germany, where like nothing matters and everyone just lets it hang out, and there's the gender or sex or anything like that doesn't really come into it, and everyone's really comfortable. Or like I once went to spa in Amsterdam, and it was like, you know, terrifyingly liberating how much nobody cared who you were or what you looked like. And then the other half of me thinks back to times, particularly as a growing girl, as someone who was a teenager on the cusp of becoming a woman. And I think of the times in which my biological reality was very important to me, often because I was learning that I was attracted to boys and wanted to get into relationships with them. But also thinking back to, you know, not to be too crass about it, spending lunch times in the safe space of, you know, often the girls' toilets, talking to other girls and figuring out what it was that we had in common and what it was that was different about us to our male counterparts. And that's not to suggest that there wasn't difference within those groups, but I then feel quite attached to that idea that biological sex might be important to understand what's happening to you as you grow up. And, you know, obviously different people with different experiences aside, as someone mentioned in the front, not everyone wants to go through the biological sex, recognizing puberty, boy meets girl, girl meets boy, happy ever after. But for lots of us, that was quite an important defining factor. And so is there, you know, at the risk of opening a can of worms, is there part of the problem with a denial of biological reality or a poo-pooing of it, is that you deny those spaces where kids start to think about who they are, who they want to become, and who they want to eventually spend the rest of their lives with, as it were.
There was a study in 2019 that you may know about that showed that 42% of people who identified as transgender or non-binary met the diagnostic threshold for a diagnosis of autism. That's when the general autism levels in the UK are generally around 1 to 2%, depending on the study you look at. So 42% being that criteria. And that Dr. Stagg, who led the study, said that was mostly pushed, that number was massively pushed by females, girls on the autism spectrum. And I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts on the crossover between autism and gender dysphoria. My contention is, and anyone's welcome to speak to me about it afterwards, but my contention is that autism in girls causes gender dysphoria. And I say that as someone with both autism and gender dysphoria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting discussion. I suppose I wanted to throw something else into the mix, perhaps. Sex, not biological sex, but, you know, the act of making love or intercourse, sexy or whatever we want to call it. Exactly, sexy sex. And yeah, I suppose it comes from, I grew up in a kind of single parent household, mother, 2 sisters. And between the ages of sort of 5 and 10, I spent a lot of time in my sister's dresses. Thankfully, the DSM wasn't as it is now, because I may look very different now. I don't know. Who knows? And I usually did it kind of in secret, and I don't know why I did it or why I enjoyed it. This is getting recorded. I should probably not say too much. But, you know, Freud would have a field day. Anyway, once I got caught, and my mum was very accepting and said, you know, you can wear dresses if you want, it kind of lost its enjoyment. So make of that what you will. But I suppose, I think for me, the point I'm trying to make is, you know, that period for me was that weird period of childhood where you're kind of getting sort of sexual, you know, feelings, or you're being introduced into the sexual world. You don't quite know what's going on. And for me, I think, you know, the kind of dress wearing hopefully had nothing to do with my sisters, but just the act of wearing the dresses, you know, I think that was part of my kind of sexual development, my understanding of what I was attracted to. And so how important is it, I think we said, you know, have conversations about sex, and I assume you're referring to biological sex and gender, but how important is it to have broader conversations about having sex, because that's tied into it, I assume.
And desire and
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
Hi, I'm a bit conscious that I'm a bit older than most of the other people who've spoken from the audience and more in line with the age of the panel. I'm a psychologist who works with children and young people. Prior to being a psychologist, I was a teacher. I have real concerns that we're not able to give children and young people that space to explore what they need to explore. I'm conscious that adolescence has always been a period of pushing boundaries and exploring and finding out about yourself. Also, that adolescence is a particular time of peer pressure and needing to belong to an in-group where you might not be able to explore what is really inside you, what's really going on for you, and a particular concern about the push for affirming therapy at the moment, and the issue about banning conversion therapy, which now looks likely it might be again pushing us towards affirming what somebody comes into the therapy room with than allowing them to explore what might be going on for them. And that's my concern.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
I'm trying to get my head around this, and I'm not doing a very good job. So far, I actually haven't heard any kind of concrete definition of what gender actually means. To me, we're using the words biological sex. As far as I can see, that's primarily an issue of anatomy. And perhaps anatomy is not just a question of what organs, physical organs you have in your body, and, you know, differences of genitalia, your pelvic size, but also there may be different structures in the brain as well. I don't know. In gender, when one says, if someone says, I feel that I am of another sex, or that I'm in the wrong body, what does that, that's now gender, and above and beyond, I don't know, some certain behaviors, certain articles of clothing, facial and cosmetics and decoration. I mean, if you were living in the savannah in Africa, you know, where women don't wear skirts, I mean, what would that mean? What would it mean to be a different gender in a different society, which doesn't have the norms that we're all used to here? And the one thing that I would say is that, you know, to anybody who's thinking that, you know, sex is a cultural construct, and gender may have some cultural constructs to it for sure, but in terms of biological sex, there is certainly one aspect of females, and that is that they get pregnant or can get pregnant, and they can and do have children, and that, I think, creates a whole dynamic which is no male can possibly understand. I certainly don't, it would scare me. And societies and cultures have developed gender and cultural gender identities specifically to deal with that reality of the fact that women have children, and societies just can't have women having children all over the place without those children being protected and in some way being held by the society. That varies from society to society, obviously.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I find the discussion very tricky. I'm a teacher and I pulled a short straw. I'm at a new school and I had to teach year 11 PHSE and had to teach the whole question of transgender a couple of Fridays ago. And I'm genuinely unclear, so I want to think out loud and the panel and the audience can tell me. So first of all, I actually loved the title because the title was How Do We Talk About Gender? And it got me thinking who should be talking about gender? Should it be us teachers, or should it be families and your local community and wider culture, ordinary people in the street? Because I'm not sure that the teacher has a privileged position or any advantage over anybody else, but it's been turned into that situation. So so really this is what I'm thinking out loud about. See, X amount of years ago, say 30 or 40 years ago, schools were these places where we tried to reflect the culture of society. We called it socialization. It seems today, in many instances, our norms and our culture are unclear, but we're expecting the schools to nonetheless deliver a line to the kids, like for example on transgender. And it seems that what we're engaged in now is no longer socialization, but what you might call social or moral or cultural engineering. It's like top down, and we're trying to tell those kids, but some of them are going home to their families, especially I teach in North London, but some are going home to their families, and this is a bit crude to put it like this, especially in what you might call working class communities, and their mums and dads and aunts and uncles would say to them, and this is what one of the boys said to me in my class, an Albanian boy, quite a naughty boy, but I get on with him. During the lesson, this is what he said. He said, "Sir, if somebody says they're a woman and they're wearing a dress and have a penis, they're a man." And then a couple of really nice girls in the class call him transphobic. And because I get on with them, we managed to have a civil debate. But the question I want to leave you with is, I mean, is the problem that lad's transphobic? Is the problem that people are intolerant, not letting that lad and his family have the view that the person with a penis who says they're a woman are actually a man? Question mark.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's bring it back to the panel and then we'll come back out finally. So panel, just a kind of 1 minute on anything. I know there's a lot going on, but just pick up on one thing for a minute. And let's start this side. Katie, if I start with you.
I'd love to dive into this gentleman's question because I think it's really healthy to have that, but I'm not sure I can do that in 1 minute, but grab me afterwards if not. Very, very quickly then, a couple of things that was said, even going back to something you said, Ella, about, safe space for teenage girls in the toilets to be able to discuss their developing bodies without boys being there or anything else like that. One of the ways I think that we have to find a way forward through this morass, through this intersection of rights and the cake of equality and all these other aspects of diversity and inclusion is, and I think what we've done at the moment is we've created this binary polarized culture war around this. And it's become sex v gender. So you've got the kind of the gender critical side saying it's sex, not gender. You've got many on the trans side saying it's gender, not sex, effectively. And what's wrong with both? And what's wrong with accepting that one is biological, one is psychological, one is culturally expressive. And that, in its sense, the cultural expression of it is a reaction to the actual cultural oppression of it. Gender is the tool and the means, you might argue, is the social construct itself to even say this, but gender is one of the means of the oppression through sex, particularly of women. And it's okay to combine those statements like that and to acknowledge that one is the means of attacking or controlling the other. And so I live next door, but to quite a well-known gender critical feminist who actually supported me through my transition as an individual. But we have great arguments about what we think about gender and also about race because she's a black woman. And we both argue that gender and race are like the tools and the means of oppressions, whereas sex and colour are the actual biological aspects. So it's the same kind of argument to some extent. And I think some people who are looking at gender identity and using gender identity is they're using it as an alternative, modern, younger way to exit the oppression. It's like the Matrix. She's saying this is how I'm leaving the Matrix, and one of the ways I'm doing that is by defining gender for myself, and it's not based on biology as destiny, which is why we've got the second and third wave feminism distinction there as well. So one of my ways of going forward in a constructive way would be to say that let's, instead of thinking like it's either or, why not have and there isn't an equal sign between the two. They're not identical either. And when we're looking at language and when we're looking at facilities, let's look at the addition of language and facilities rather than the replacement or erasure of language and facilities. So in other words, don't make all school toilets gender neutral, add gender neutral toilets. So there still remains girls and women's spaces, but there are also inclusive spaces. And so if we do that, to me, that is one of the ways through this morass. And I think going back very quickly on the autism, neurodiversity angle with gender dysphoria as well, yes, I think there is a link. But I also think one of the links around that is because we've designed a world for neurotypicals, and anyone who is neurodiverse is already outside of the matrix as well, because we've presented them this binary way of doing sex and gender, and anyone who is neurodiverse is already seeing it differently and not, engaging with the matrix in that same way. So again, I would say around, say, therapy and all the other supportive measures, it's neither conversion therapy, and I'm quite comfortable with it being banned, nor is it confirmation therapy. As I said in my opening, let's get back to some kind of supportive, discovery, explorative therapy.
Brilliant. Thank you. Chrissy?
Okay, I mean, one of the things that made me nervous about this discussion today is that I knew beforehand that we were going to have a very rich, diverse sort of number of contributions and points, because it is a fascinating area. Unfortunately, it rarely gets discussed in that way. So I can only pick up on a few things. To do with the question from here about the teacher or the parent, who do we trust? I would like to link that back to something I said in my initial points, which is to do with the inner mood idea of authenticity. That if you feel deep inside yourself, this is so important to who I am, and this could relate to so many different things, it's impossible for someone else to say, yes, it's true, or no, it isn't. Now, it is absolutely impossible for most of us to distinguish between someone who has got a deep-seated gender dysphoria, absolutely needs to express themselves through a transgendered identity, and someone who thinks this might be an easy way to access women in some way or another, like the disproportionate number of male prisoners who are identifying as trans in order to move to female prisons. Are they all genuine? Of course not. How do we decide which ones are, which ones aren't? It's very difficult. Yes, I'd just like to pick one other thing, which is how we explain it. Yes, I gave a tentative idea. One of the things we might want to take into account in how we understand gender dysphoria, but that's less important, I think, than the general acceptance. And what is the good news is that the public are genuinely and generally far more accepting than they certainly used to be. A recent few statistics from a recent social attitudes survey here. 84% of the British population say they're not at all prejudiced against trans people. 85% accept that it's not in any way a trivial thing. And 72% of women are completely comfortable with trans women using public toilets. That's good news. We don't need to enforce social norms to the extent that some people on the pro-trans side of this debate seem to believe.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll try and be quick. There's so much that I would like to have said in response to them, in response to so many of the questions, and I'm really heartened by the fact that we're just having this debate and the questions that you're asking. The fact that I would enjoy so much having more time to have these sorts of discussions, but I'll try and just pick up on a few things. Somebody asked whether does biological sex still need to be relevant at all if we're moving to this, it's all about individual expression, and whatever your individual expression, your own choices are. I think that there's I understand the point behind that, and I think there is something around that in that, yes, it's the kind of feminist idea that, sex isn't destiny. But there is biological sex still will always have some relevance, and I think the man towards the front, talking about the fact that women and the girls who are going to grow up to be women are the sex who will have babies. There are some real clear roles that go with having certain biologies that will impact how certain decisions that you make in your life. They will have influence in your life. And when you're a very small child, you know, I was talking about we don't necessarily need to talk about gender at all. Very small children, which sex they are, really doesn't matter. But I think the older you get, the particularly going into adolescence, then the impact of, and I'm talking here about girls, I mean there obviously is conversely you could talk about boys, but I think it's particularly relevant to girls, and I was a girl so I have more experience of this, is that your biology does start to have some significance. Now it shouldn't impact on the opportunities you have or the choices that you are open to you, but girls and young women and women who are having children do need to have particular issues thinking of the impact on them, and they will need to think around those. So biological sex does remain relevant. And then I think that links to the question that the somebody asked about autism and girls. And I think what I've just said there about adolescent girls and the becoming aware of the impact of your biology is linked to what we're seeing in the link between autism and teenage girls and identifying with gender dysphoria. And you can start to see that if you know something about autism, and you can start to link it to Chrissy's categorization kind of areas where people with autism will tend to have quite rigid thinking, where they will want to fit things very clearly into categorizations. And when things don't work in that way, it can be particularly distressing for people who have those more rigid thought patterns. And also people with autism will often find in that identity exploration that's going on for all adolescents, that they're not necessarily able to find their tribe, their group. They don't have that sense of belonging that maybe some of their other peer group, and this might provide that sense of belonging. It's like, I don't know where I am, but I can fit into this category, and that relieves a lot of this kind of emotional distress that I might be experiencing. I would also add to that, while I'm talking, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll make this. When we're talking about girls, it's not just girls with autism. There's been a huge rise, I think 4,000% in adolescent girls identifying as trans. So there are particular issues for that group, which I won't go into now, but I think we need to talk about. And that's the point I keep coming back to, is the discussion we're having now, so much of it is unresolved. We need to talk about it more with adolescents and young people.
Brilliant, thanks.
Briefly, I just want to thank the person from the back for the voice of reason. Yeah, we're not toddlers. Gender isn't sex, and we must talk about both. What I worry about, though, is we move away from gender expression to gender identity, which then does conflate the two. We must talk about sex. As was said, only one sex gets pregnant, and the other sex experiences male sexuality, which is something we don't talk about enough either, because that is something to be experienced as a male. And if we deny it, if we deny those things, if we deny sex, we allow the male sex basically a free rein to exploit the other sex, and that's what concerns me. And we're in danger of denying the female sex even the language to describe the exploitation, and that does worry me.
Okay, right, let's go out to the panel. We've got 5 minutes left. Just bear that in mind for what? Because I want to get enough people in.
I think obviously the panel has tried to be as conciliatory as possible, accommodating other people's talks and talking about being open and age appropriate. But let's face the reality, things are very, very different to that, because a small minority of people in society, mainly trans people, but not by any means exclusively trans people, have weaponized this whole discussion. And a lot of the ideology, right, is being pushed through politicians who don't know where to draw the line, and pushed through, if you like, teaching unions, other groups in society, who think it's quite reasonable to argue that a 3-year-old can be trans, or that it's appropriate for primary school children to be having discussions in which gender identity is discussed as a matter of fact, and all of these terms and terminology are completely confused. So I think we've got to be realistic. We're starting from a point where actually the whole issue has also got tied up with your right to actually challenge this. I'm obviously a TERF. As far as I'm concerned, you can't declare you're a woman if you still have a penis. You can't declare yourself a woman if you've had a sexual reorientation, because you're not. You can't, as some people have emphasized, confuse the two. So I think we need to be realistic. And what I couldn't agree more about with the speaker here, it shouldn't be teachers who are having to adopt this ideological position and socially engineer it in not just secondary schools, where sure you can have an open discussion, but in primary schools as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
My point is on developmentally appropriate shared language, which is who gets to decide what that language is and why.
Thank you. Very nice. Okay, with the microphone here, yes.
Claire, right? You talked about that there was a rise in adolescent girls identifying as boys, and there was like a 400% rise. And the way you said it, 4,000% rise. And the way you said it, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, made it seem as though you didn't quite believe that all of them truly identified as trans. And I is that correct? Did you?
Well, can you finish your question?
Sorry, yes, of course. And truly, I'm not really on either side of the debate, but I was curious as to what you thought about maybe if they perhaps didn't truly identify as a man, could it have something to do with the fact that female sexuality is portrayed as being vulnerable and male sexuality portrayed as being powerful in the media, and that for women growing up, their sexuality is so confusing because of that, and they might want to identify as a man to get out of that because it's so painful growing up as a girl? I thought maybe you had a comment on that. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, very quickly.
Just a quick comment about heterosexuality and homosexuality as political ideology. I wonder, after so many decades and years of normalizing heterosexuality and cisgender normativity, why we become so ferocious about pushing against a different ideology, saying that's political ideology, and the opposite is just natural science, the way it's supposed to be. I think that's a question we should ask: why a certain way of thinking is political ideology, pushing it to people's mouth, and reverse engineering another side of teaching is just natural, supposed to be social production.
Okay, brilliant. Speakers, you're challenged to leave the audience with something in 30 seconds. Let's do it in the order in which we started with. So, Deborah.
I just want to thank the audience for asking such great questions and for adding to a rich debate. I don't think we do this often enough. I think we have got differences of opinion in this room, and if we talk to each other about them, we may understand where everybody's coming from. So thank you very much, everybody.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, let's clap. I was going to say do it all at once, but they're too good, so let's clap each. Okay, Katie.
Okay, very briefly. Understand history, understand science, understand psychology, understand the fucking lot of them, and explore yourself as a human being. Where we're at now is not where we will be. Where we've come from has changed too. Like the gentleman there just said, like we've moved on in terms of the way we treated homosexuality. Let's potentially also keep moving on in terms of the way we treat gender identity, transsexualism, transgender, whatever language you want to call it, come from a different generation, different language. Let's move towards a point where we're talking about human rights and personhood in decades from now, hopefully maybe years rather than decades, and let's start moving towards a better future for everyone in that sense.
Thank you very much. Claire.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to the question that was put directly to me. I would agree with everything that you posed there is kind of hypothetical about what's going on. I think we need to talk about it much, much more, because I think there's a lot of other hypotheses. But what I would say is there's definitely something going on with when you've got that number of girls, 4,000% increase. And yes, we need to talk about that and work out what is going on. Then I would also just address maybe my last comment to the teacher and the TERF, and I would agree with you both that the approach that schools are being put in a very, very difficult position here. Part of what we do about addressing that and the reality of where we are is having discussions like this and insisting we have discussions like this and opening it up and going back to those principles that I went to, that I mentioned at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Claire. And Chrissy.
Okay, my final point might sound slightly counterintuitive, but I actually think that primarily the phenomenally major role that trans issues have taken in the culture wars, the so-called culture wars, has very little to do with sex or gender. It's got something to do with the ways in which the transgender identity seems to exemplify so many things of identity in general. And so my final parting shot is identity politics, I think, largely tends to ignore both the individual and the whole of society. So to give one example, it is true that trans people are more likely to be homeless than the general population. The solution has to do with how we get rid of homelessness. It doesn't matter if you're homeless, what the characteristics are. It matters the fact that we need to solve that problem.
Thank you very much, Chrissy.